All right, so we're on to our next section now, which is going to be on the urinary system. And so the main idea with this chapter is we're going to look at the type of waste eliminated by the urinary system, as well as how that waste actually gets filtered out of the blood and gets transformed into what eventually will become part of what you would call urine. So in the body, there is water located in multiple components. There's water located inside the cells. We call this the intracellular component. It's inside the cytoplasm of the cells, for example. And there's also water located outside the cells. So that would be the extracellular compartment. So if you think about, for example, blood plasma, right? All that water in the blood plasma is not located inside cells, so it would be part of the extracellular component of the water inside the body. Now, because we have water located in these two environments, there's water inside of cells and there's water outside of cells, it becomes really important to make sure that we as vertebrates, and really not just vertebrates, but any animal, really have to try hard to make sure that those two different components of water are as balanced as possible, because if they're not, then we run into the issue of water being pulled out of cells or water being forced into cells, and neither one of those is going to be a real desirable solution for the animal that's actually going through this process. So we're trying to maintain homeostasis, trying to make sure that the concentrations of solutes inside the cells and outside the cells is relatively similar, at least for an animal, as well as we also need to maintain concentrations of certain ions. So we start looking at things like sodiums and potassiums and calciums and chlorides. Those are really important ions to maintain homeostasis for, so that our various physiological functions can be maintained as much as possible. So the excretion aspect of the urinary system is concerned with eliminating waste from the body, other excess substances from the body as well. So not just waste, but if you overconsume water, for example, the urinary system is going to be an outlet for that excess water before it has a chance to become harmful to the body. So it's feasible that if you drank too much water, if you didn't, or if you couldn't get that excess water out of the body quickly enough, it could raise blood pressure to the point where it could start causing damage to different aspects of your body. We're also going to be involved with getting rid of metabolic waste, things like carbon dioxide, excess water produced by metabolism. Urinary system is also involved in thermal regulation, so getting rid of excess heat, excess salts, nitrogen-containing waste. This differs depending on the type of animal that you're looking at. For a fish, it would be ammonia. For a mammal, it would be something like urea. For a bird or a reptile, it would be uric acid. You can look at creatinine. Those kinds of things also can be eliminated from the body as well through the urine. So it's a really critical sort of a system for helping to maintain homeostasis for these different aspects of our function. Sodium is going to be one of the main cation or positively charged ion outside the cells. Chloride is the major anion. So we look at the terms cation. All that means is a positively charged ion. For this sodium ion, it actually has one more proton than it has electrons, so therefore it has an overall positive charge. Chloride ions are kind of the opposite. They pick up one extra electron, so they have actually, it turns out, 18 electrons but only 17 protons. Therefore, they have an overall plus negative charge, or actually an overall extra negative charge, I should say. There are some other ones that we call divalent cations. This would be like calcium and magnesium. So both of these two have lost 2 electrons, and so they have 2 more protons than electrons, thereby creating an overall plus 2 charge. There are some other monovalent cations I mentioned, like potassium, for example. Those are also fairly important when we start looking at things like neuron function. So it's really critical to maintain homeostasis for not only the ions, but water itself. And so back in chapter 4, we talked about osmosis. We talked about the idea of osmotic pressure, where you have 2 different concentrated solutes on 2 sides of a membrane. There is going to be a tendency for water to move in one direction or another. So for example, in this picture on the slide here, we have on the left a solution that's relatively dilute on the left and a solution that's relatively concentrated on the right. And so the overall tendency here is for water to move from left to right, and for the level of the water in the right side to go up as a result. Osmolarity, we start looking at things like overall concentrations. We could talk about tonicity, which we also mentioned back in chapter 4. Tonicity is the relative tendency to either gain or lose water. So in this picture, this solution over here on the right is relatively hypertonic. It's going to tend to gain water. And this solution over here is relatively hypotonic. It's going to tend to lose water, where hypo is below and hyper is above. So hypotonic is going to tend to lose water, and hypertonic is going to tend to gain water. Right? So we talked about those terms also back in chapter 4. So just a bit of review, because these terms and the whole idea of osmosis is really what the concept of the urinary system is built upon. It doesn't work without osmosis and without the ability of water to move from one concentration to another concentration. When it comes time to get rid of waste, right, we talked about different aspects of the body that can get rid of waste. We look at the lungs that get rid of excess heat, excess CO2, excess water vapor. If you look at your dog when it's hot, so dogs don't have sweat glands, you probably know that. If they're hot, what do? They pant. And by water evaporating from their mouth and also heat being pumped out of their lungs, that helps them to cool off their bodies. But we also get rid of carbon dioxide and water vapor at the same time. We use the skin to get rid of excess heat also. Excess water, bicarbonate ions, salts, urea, uric acid, all those kinds of things, even other substances too, can be lost through sweat glands if necessary. Gastrointestinal tract, we get rid of solid waste, so fiber, right, that you can't digest, cellulose that you can't digest, as well as metabolic wastes can be digested. We talked about biopigments back in the chapter earlier in the chapter on the digestive system as metabolic waste. Those are eliminated through the GI tract as well. And then from the kidneys, again, we see water. You kind of get the sense that both water and heat are kind of important waste products because we see them being eliminated through like 3 different avenues in the body: the lungs, the skin, and the kidneys. Bicarbonate ions can be disposed of through the urine. Various salts, inorganic salts, sodiums and chlorides, those kinds of things. Hydrogen ions, so the kidneys are also a really important way to help maintain pH of the blood. If you have a relative tendency to become acidic in the blood, the kidneys can help pump out H pluses, get rid of the H pluses, and therefore increase the pH or decrease the acidity of the blood, as well as urea, uric acid, and creatinine, like we mentioned before. We talked a little bit previously about what happens when you break down certain kinds of products. If you break down proteins, for example, if you break down nucleic acids, for example, you get these various byproducts, nitrogenous byproducts, like ammonia. Right? Ammonia is really toxic. So what happens here is when you take an amino acid, like one of the components of protein, take an amino acid, break it down, you have to take the amino group off of the amino acid first. And what that does is it creates a degree of nitrogenous waste. We've got NH2, which is an ammonia group. If we then add an H plus to that, we get what's called ammonia. And ammonia is fairly toxic. And so we have to find some way to get rid of it safely in a dilute way so that we don't over concentrate this stuff and actually poison our cells in the process. So as it turns out, different kinds of vertebrates get rid of nitrogenous waste in different ways depending on what kinds of resources they have available to them. Mammals can produce uric acid in small amounts, typically not a huge amount, but there is some production of uric acid when you start breaking down certain nucleic acids, but not so much for amino acids. So the nucleic acids, again, would involve things like nucleotides, which contain purines. If you break these down, turn them into energy, for example, you do create a small amount of uric acid. If you break down amino acids, on the other hand, you get ammonia, which is then converted into urea later on, which is easier to dispose of. All right, so there's an enzyme here called uricase. And uricase is an enzyme that helps convert uric acid, which is water insoluble. It's hydrophobic. It doesn't dissolve very well in water. With uricase working on uric acid, we make a substance called allantoin, which actually is more water soluble and much easier to get rid of in the urine than uric acid would be. So the urine is primarily water-based. We want to have this byproduct being water soluble so it can actually leave with the urine as opposed to separating out from the urine. Humans, on the other hand, don't have this enzyme. And there's humans, and the other main animal, oddly enough, that doesn't have uricase is Dalmatian, the breed of dog, Dalmatian, the black and white spotted dog, don't have uricase. So we have a tendency, if there's an overproduction of uric acid that accumulates in the joints, that results in a condition called gout, which can be very painful and somewhat treatable now. There are medications out there, prescription things, which basically serve the same function as uricase to allow folks to dispose of uric acid before the point where it builds up and produces that gout condition. If we look at fishes, fish's primary waste product metabolically is ammonia. Ammonia is toxic, but then again, if you're a fish and you secrete ammonia, you're surrounded by water and it's diluted immediately. So they actually can use ammonia as a waste product. Mammals and amphibians tend to use, and cartilaginous fish also use urea. So urea is our kind of main metabolic byproduct, nitrogen-containing byproduct. It is water soluble. It is relatively inexpensive to produce, but the big drawback to urea is that it uses a lot of water. So if you're an aquatic animal like an amphibian or a shark, or if you're a mammal that's not terribly water limited, urea works out pretty well because it's metabolically cheap, and um, having excess water in the environment is not really too big of a limitation. If, on the other hand, you're a bird or a reptile, they're going to go with the strategy of using uric acid, which is much more expensive to produce metabolically, but uses almost no water. And for reptiles, many reptiles live in very dry environments where having excess water is not really a luxury they have. So they're going to use uric acid as a byproduct so that they don't have to use excess water to get rid of their waste. Birds, on the other hand, always trying to save on weight to help them fly. So they also use uric acid as a way to get rid of their metabolic waste because, again, it doesn't use any water and they don't have to carry around all that excess heavy weight with them in the form of water. So next up, we're going to look at the parts of the urinary system. We'll take a look at the components and take a look at some of the functionality of the urinary system as well before we get actually into the filtering aspect. The function of the urinary system are to regulate blood volume, to regulate pH, pressure, and the composition of blood. And when I say composition, what that means is how much water is there versus how much solute is there, how many ions are there, how much metabolic waste is in the blood. So it's regulating what actually is in the blood by filtering it. The kidneys are the main part of the urinary system that does this, right? So they're going to take things out of the blood. They're going to return some of the things back into the blood. So there's a huge amount of filtering that takes place at the kidney. Some of the material that comes out of the kidney eventually goes back into the blood. So for example, a huge part of the water that you filter through your kidneys, the vast majority of it goes right back into your circulatory system. It is in the order of hundreds of liters, if not more, of water per day. When you think about how much blood you have in your circulatory system, that blood's passing through your kidneys multiple times per day. You're looking at hundreds or even thousands of liters of water per day being circulated out of the kidneys and then back into your blood. And only the amount of water you need to get rid of your waste is actually lost from the circulatory system. Things that are not reabsorbed are going to pass out of the body in the form of urine. So any type of metabolic waste, any excess ions, any excess H pluses, those kinds of things are going to become part of the urine, and they're going to pass out of the body in that regard. The ureters are the part of the circulatory system that connects the kidneys to the urinary bladder. Urinary bladder is where urine is temporarily stored until it can be expelled from the body. And then from the urinary bladder, we also have a urethra, which carries urine from the bladder on out through the body, out from the body. So those are kind of the main components. It's sort of a macroscopic scale: kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. Again, just to kind of reiterate, kidneys are the part that filters. Ureters carry the urine from the kidney to the bladder. Bladder stores the urine. Urethra carries urine from the bladder on out to the outside of the body. All right, so those are kind of our main functions. This guy looks pretty intense. For having the mid part of his body removed, he looks pretty serious, I guess. I guess I would be too if that were with me. But we have the main parts here. Kidneys kind of in the lower to mid part of the dorsal side of the back. We have ureters carrying the material from the kidneys down to the bladder, and then from the bladder we have a urethra carrying the urine on out of the body. Okay, so next up we're going to take a look at the kidneys and homeostasis as it pertains to water balance in the blood, ion balance in the blood, and so forth. Most animals in the animal kingdom, and vertebrates in particular, are not what you would call osmoconformers. Osmoconformers sort of go with whatever the environment is in terms of concentration and solute balance. They maintain the same concentration. So this animal on this slide, this not very attractive animal by most accounts, is called a hagfish, and they actually are osmoconformers. Whatever the environment is around them, that's going to be the concentration of their blood as well. And that's really kind of a cool thing to be able to do because you don't have to spend a lot of energy osmoregulating. You just sort of go with the flow, and whatever the environment is, that's what you are as well. So you don't have to spend a lot of time or energy or effort maintaining concentrations different from what's around you. You just go with what's around you. So like I said, only the hagfish are osmoconformers. All of the other vertebrates that we see are what we call osmoregulators. And osmoregulators are those that change the concentration of their internal environment regardless of what's going on the outside of the body. So for example, an animal in salt water has to maintain the tendency to not lose water and get rid of any excess ions that must come in. They're osmoregulating in the regard they have to continuously take in water to replace water that's lost and get rid of ions that are continuously coming into the body. If you look at a freshwater fish, on the other hand, it's the exact opposite thing. So for the freshwater fish, ions are tending to leave their body, water's tending to go into their body as well. Water's tending to go into their body. Sorry, I had to think for a second. Water's going in, ions are going out. They have to osmoregulate to make sure that they have the right concentration of both water and ions in their blood as well. So again, this is a very expensive kind of a thing. We're maintaining consistent osmolarity despite different concentrations in the environment. Regardless of what the environment is, these animals maintain what they need as their conditions. They're spending a ton of time and effort and energy to do this. If we look at on land, terrestrial vertebrates, right? So in terrestrial vertebrates, there's a much higher concentration of water in their bodies than what there is in the surrounding air. So the general tendency then is for our bodies to tend to lose water. We lose water every time we breathe out. Our lungs lose water. Our skin loses water by evaporation as we sweat, or even if we're not actively sweating, there's still some water lost from the skin as well. And so our urinary and osmoregulatory systems are going to help to maintain water as much as possible. So they're a really kind of dynamic and flexible system to help us make sure we have the right amount of water in our system at all times. The actual filtration process, we'll go ahead and start now. The filtration process starts when there is fluid entering into the kidney tubules, or the kidney nephrons, through a structure called the glomerulus. A glomerulus is part of a nephron. A nephron is a kidney cell. Each kidney cell has a glomerulus, which is kind of the filtering part. So blood is pushed under relatively high pressure up against the walls of the glomerulus, and that's where we're going to see some filtration happen. The material going through the glomerulus is going to be things like small molecules. Could be glucose, for example. It's going to be water. It could be waste products. It could be ions, of course, hydrogen ions, sodium ions, potassium ions, calcium ions. Those kinds of things can go through the glomerulus as well. At that point, most of the things that have passed through the filter are going to go back into the blood. So most of the molecules, the glucose, as long as there isn't too much, the various ions, as long as there aren't too much, the water, all of those things are going to go back into the blood. So it's going to go from the blood through the glomerulus back into the blood. And any materials that we don't want to have going back into the blood can then be passed on through the rest of the nephron and eventually become part of the filtrate, which is what you eventually will refer to as being urine. Now, this glomerulus and this filtration process is incredibly flexible, and it can change second by second. Sometimes you might reabsorb all the water that you filter through, so if you're really dehydrated, you're going to tend to want to lose as little water as possible. You're going to want to create a very concentrated urine to maintain what water you do have inside your body. On the other hand, if you drink too much water, well, now you want to get rid of the excess water. So the glomerulus can actually pass more water through itself and reabsorb less water into the blood to help you get rid of the excess water. So it's a very, very flexible kind of a system that helps us maintain water homeostasis moment by moment almost. Any waste products, of course, these are going to go back on out of the body. Right? So they're not going to be reabsorbed. They're going to be passed on out of the body. They're going to move on to the ureters, bladder, urethra, and then from there on out of the body. So we're going to actually stop here because this is a section that's going to take a little bit of time to explain, going through the different aspects and parts of a nephron. This structure here is a nephron. We see the glomerulus here that we talked about on the previous slide, and then we see this tubule, what we call a proximal. Proximal means it's close to the glomerulus. We see what's called a loop of Henle. We see what's called a distal arm. Distal means it's far away or at a distance from the glomerulus. And then eventually we see a collecting duct down here, and this eventually filters on into the ureters, which then carry the material off to the bladder. But the function of this, the structure is one thing. It's relatively straightforward, but the function of the nephrons requires enough explanation that we're actually going to stop here, and I'll pick it up with the next section.